Well, a week later, I get called in to see the chair of the department and told that I'm a transphobe.
Obviously, getting an education is the main point of university, but isn't that type of conversation and debate and critical thinking the whole point?
We can have debates like that, but they need to have trigger warnings, essentially. I just thought, oh my God, this is a clown house. This is the University of Toronto. Well, fine. Being offended doesn't mean you're right. But I would say 9 out of 10 academics are deranged in this particular area.
Hello, and welcome to Awake at the Wheel. So a few episodes ago, Orrin and I discussed the feminization of the field of psychology. So before you get offended by that term, go back and watch our episode and see what it is that I'm referring to here. But interestingly, it doesn't appear to be isolated only to the social sciences and the field of psychology. It seems that this shift in demographics in universities at large and even in the physical sciences has also been taking place. There's a professor at the University of Toronto that's caught a lot of flack lately, however, with regard to these thoughts and with these opinions, one of which I came across in a video that I'm going to share before we get talking about this very topic. So let's check out this video that illustrates some of the concerns surrounding this professor's views.
Professor from the University of Toronto was recently in the news for sharing his gender ideology conspiracy theory. Professor of Biotechnology Leigh Revers claimed that universities are matriarchal enterprises run by women for women in pursuit of retribution for patriarchy of the past. And before we get to the article itself, you might be thinking, wait, a University of Toronto professor who's making bizarre claims about the feminization of academia. Haven't we been here before? If you had that thought, it comes as no surprise then that a quote from the disgraced former University of Toronto professor Jordan Peterson appears at the top of Leigh Revers' Substack. Revers also hits all of the classic tropes of a Peterson editorial. He says in the opening paragraph that he refuses to call first-year students fresh women or fresh people, which, to be clear, absolutely no one had asked him to do, much less ordered. His writing is also full of purple prose. As if he went to the thesaurus function in Microsoft Word for every other adjective and noun and just selected whatever popped up first. Inebriated adventures, palpitating anxieties, and self-examinations. I have never heard a more unsexy and boomer description of what it's like to be an undergrad. There is so much in this article that I could pick apart and poke fun at, but I want to hone in on one thing in particular, which is his outrageous but entirely unsurprising lack of self-awareness. His Revers' actual point, his thesis, is that universities that are dominated by women are no longer a suitable place for people to meet their life partner. That women, because they outnumber men in these institutions, will no longer be able to find a man. This is very much unlike the past, we're told, because one of his friends at Oxford met his wife at school. Few inferred from that when Revers was in school himself back around 1990, that the gender balance must have been far closer to parity. You would, of course, be wrong. So currently, at the University of Toronto where this professor works, there are 56 women enrolled for every 44 men. Whereas at Oxford in 1993, shortly after Revers had begun his PhD, there were 57 men for every 43 women. Nearly the exact same proportion, just gender reversed. Which means it really should not be any more difficult for somebody to find a partner now than it would have been then. It also means that the universities of 30 years ago were by no means neutral. They didn't have gender parity. They just had a masculinist preference that he mistook for neutral. So save your tears for your Substack, my guy. He is much more likely to go over well with a captive audience.
Well, so the very obvious bias aside in that video, what I love about commentary such as this is that people tend to then forget how skilled and revered and good in their actual profession such individuals are. He cited Dr. Jordan Peterson, and everyone always forgets what an accomplished clinician he is. But anyways, Dr. Leigh Revers has an extensive background in biotechnology entrepreneurship and has more than 15 years of experience working in both the life sciences sector, in academia, as well as in the industry itself. Dr. Revers has trained as a chemist as well as a molecular biologist and holds a bachelor's degree and master's degree as well as doctoral degrees in physical sciences from the University of Oxford, as this individual mentioned in his little video there. But rather than Oren and I just talking about this ourselves, instead we decided, hey, why not have Dr. Revers on? So, hi, Dr. Revers. Welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Hello. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'm assuming this is only one of many pieces of commentary that you've viewed or received regarding that article in the National Post. And I'll add to that, in reading it myself, it was really interesting to see. Again, I mentioned that Oren and I just recently did have a discussion about this in our own field of psychology. And the realities of this shift really seem to be offending people. What do you think it is about this shift that people don't want to accept?
Well, yeah, sorry, I'm just still digesting that piece because I haven't seen it. Just to make a remark about purple prose, I do use a lot of words, and yes, I do use the thesaurus, so that was quite funny. But that's because I enjoy words. It's perhaps it's an English trope, but I was educated, I think, I was very lucky to get an excellent education in the UK. And so I enjoy writing, and I do enjoy using words that kind of encourage people to reach for the dictionary, actually, because that way you kind of broaden their vocabulary, right? So it's funny that he picked up on that.
You're in the right company with Oren and I, because we're both wordsmiths. Oren more so than I. When I first met him, I'm like, wow, I've met my match.
Yeah. Well, it is funny, isn't it, that when you start pulling out those, more complex words, grammar and words and so on, that people sort of get uptight and start to ridicule you. I think, look, I'm an immigrant in Canada, and so I've come to this country primarily because I wasn't very good at other languages. In fact, I mean, I had the opportunity to travel around the world to do my postdocing period of my career. And I decided to come to Canada, and so, of course, embraced the Canadian culture to a degree, and very much enjoyed this country. But I think one of the things I noticed is the linguistic differences. And so, for instance, even there, what's sort of fairly obvious, I would say, is the inability to spot humor and sarcasm and so forth in the writing. When I say, for example, he makes the remark about fresh women. I'm not going to call them fresh women or fresh people, because, I mean, that's just me joking on how, of course, there's been this linguistic sort of trope that we see from the left, actually, which is to change the meaning of words and also political correctness. So, it used to have actors and actresses, and then if suddenly actresses became impossible, you couldn't talk about them. They're all actors now. But so that was fine, okay. It was a perfectly serviceable word, but so gender distinction in language started to shift. And then you get this idea of, I don't know, spokesperson, right? It used to be a spokesman or a spokeswoman, and then spokesperson. So you started to neutralize gender in language. And so, of course, freshmen, I mean, you could do the same, couldn't you? So I was sort of riffing on that. And I just think it's funny because it's I think we need to think about this linguistic business that's going on. And going back to the gender piece, at university, I mean, it's interesting. He went back and he looked at that. I mean, I when I was at uni, it's absolutely true that it was about equal. We did have still, what was interesting, of course, he wouldn't have mentioned this, is that at Oxford at that time, we had 2 exclusively women's colleges. Right, so we had single-sex colleges, actually. None of the others were. because all male colleges had admitted women at that point. But there were still two completely female colleges. So this is kind of amusing. But overall, I mean, no doubt he's correct. It was around 50-50. Well, it was a little bit more men, and certainly it was pretty balanced in my experience. It depends on the college you went to. I would say, but certainly in my experience, it felt like a very balanced environment. What I'm sort of alluding to in my article in the National Post, however, is really what stuck out to me just really quite recently, right? Really quite recently. I think it was the graduation photograph that I linked to in the article. And if you do go and look, I mean, I think it would be hard not to notice. Right. Actually, it's not a graduation photograph. It's a returning student's photograph for my department. And you look at it, and it's just a sea of female faces. There's a handful of men in there, and that does strike me. It struck me that this doesn't quite seem right somehow. So, I mean, the feminization of university, as it has happened over the last several years, I mean, it's well documented. So it's true there are more women in higher education. I don't really have a problem with that, actually. As long as it's not an enormous bias, but it's starting to look quite, like it's starting to. I mean, in my Substack, I put an image of a painting of a nunnery, but we don't want that, surely. So we just need to make sure, I think, that we're not discouraging men from going to university. And of course, that's what Peterson has become famous for, isn't it, really, that he's sort of championing young men and how they've been disparaged in society. And also to dismiss him as a disgraced professor. I don't see he's not at all disgraced. I mean, that is rather, again, it adheres to the view, doesn't it, that universities have got it right, and that if you depart a university or which he simply left, he's an emeritus professor still, so he's still recognised by the University of Toronto. That somehow you're disgraced. I mean, just some people don't like his views. I don't think that counts as being disgraced. So, I mean, there's a number of things there. I mean, it's funny. I mean, the whole thing's funny. Sorry, we'll get back to the point, but as I say, just digesting that. Personally, what did I get as reaction to that piece? Not terribly much. The pieces I've written this past year, which are all in the National Post or on my Substack, they're really reaction to some of the things that happened to me in the last couple of years. And they are critical of the university in a number of ways, and intentionally so, of course, because I think there are insufficient voices who have, certainly from the political point of view, a more conservative outlook that are speaking out. I mean, again, what we do know about higher education is 90% or more of all professors are, politically more to the left. And that's not balanced either. I mean, and again, I'm sure this commentator would say, it would assume that the left is the correct position, and that's why it's like in the establishment, in education and in the hallways of the great universities. Of course, people think in a more sort of Marxist way, and anyone who's on the right is clearly mad and should be thrown out. And so that's kind of their view, I suspect. But it's not the case. There are people like me. I'm a scientist. I fundamentally believe in the Enlightenment values that science relies on, which really sort of emerged from, was it 17th century, 16th, 17th century England and Scotland, and have developed into what is Western science. And I have a hard time with a lot of this stuff that has now sort of infiltrated the university, which you've heard a great deal about.
Yeah, and perhaps we're saying the same thing here, and I'll preface my statement with I'm not being sexist here, but I am actually somewhat surprised to see this shift happening in the physical sciences as well. I imagine that it in part comes from the push from a young age of girls going into STEM, which I think is a great thing, but I wonder if it has created a disproportionate amount of women feeling that they have to or should go into those sciences.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I don't see any reason why women shouldn't go into science. Of course
Of
not. In
course.
fact,
Yeah.
my experience has been, again, I mean, the commentator in question, I mean, wouldn't know a great deal about my background, presumably, but if you looked into that, the supervisor for my doctoral degree was a woman. One of the most influential people during my graduate years was a woman, and taught me the most. Professor Rosalind Bill, who is in the UK as a professor, I believe at Aston University. Very lauded individual, incredibly capable. So, I'd never had any concerns about women in science. It's just it wasn't as frequent.
Mm-hmm.
And you could put this down to, well, there are barriers, right? There's always this argument in the academy that there are barriers to entry. There must be, because otherwise it would be parity, and it isn't parity in science. But of course, as Peterson points out, I mean, there are different traits between the two sexes, and women probably aren't as excited about science as some science as men are. I don't know. I mean, some women clearly are very excited about it, but I don't think we can kind of prejudge that, right? So yes, I don't know. I mean, I see a lot of women in my classes. I'm very happy to see that and don't have a problem. But more generally, I would say it's the administration of the universities, which is really where the shift has taken place. So we've got twice as many females now, in positions of authority in the administration, pulling the levers of power in the university, than men. And it's interesting, actually, the reaction I get from that, because when I've had female chairs of departments. Actually, I'm in two departments, and both chairs until very recently were female. And when I raised certain concerns in this direction, I mean, the comments were usually, well, the reason why women are, dominant in these what they would describe as pen pushing jobs is because the men are all lucky and don't want to do this sort of drudgery, and they're all off just doing research and writing grants. So it's like, we're stuck doing the hard work. This is like domestic labor kind of thing, which I do find amusing, because administrators make more money.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, they make.
It's a tough job.
Yeah, and actually, if I can chime in, because I know in my classes, when I've talked, in the various classes and talk about, the disparities, and I say, like, look, women now comprise the majority of, of students who enter university, who finish university. I'm not sure. I don't think at the doctoral level or the master's level they've reached that yet. But when I say this, and then my students will chime in and say, okay, yes, but they only occupy the lowest levels of, of any field. And I say, look around you, look at your professors. Okay, look at, and they see there's more and more female professors. And again, they still go to that trope of it's all on the lowest levels. And so as you're talking about the shift toward, these higher positions, instead of recognizing, oh, okay, well, what we thought either was wrong or it's changed. Now they just, basically malign those positions. They say, wow, like, again, when the men are in those positions, it's power. When women are in those positions, they're unlucky. It's drudgery. So it just
totally, goes. Totally asymmetric, right? The way that it's perceived. So you just adapt to whatever your view is, don't you? You say, well, we didn't want these jobs at all. These are not the jobs that we wanted. We're stuck with these jobs. But if they didn't have those jobs, it'd be like, well, the men are running everything, and it's a patriarchy. So no, I'm familiar with that, and it just doesn't make sense. I mean, that's the point of this. I object to most of what's been going on, simply because it doesn't make sense at all. I mean, there's this sort of push, right, to achieve equality, equity, I should say, which is, of course, this sort of equality of outcome. And there's no reason for that, right? There's no reason for that. What we should be doing is, obviously, we should concern ourselves with lowering barriers for everyone to enter. So equality, certainly. But everything should be determined on merit. And it's always these attempts to kind of correct for what is perceived to be in the past sort of privilege, if you will, in particular areas. So we're going to we're going to correct a wrong with a further wrong. We're going to it doesn't make sense to me at all. So that's where I fundamentally object, because then we get we get diverted from trying to do the best science, let's say. Right. So, so we've seen diversity hires certainly within the academy as I would see it. Because there are all of these programs that try to correct for, as I say, the past, right? So we have scholarships that are, exclusively, let's say, for Black individuals. We have scholarships that are focused on Indigenous people of Canada. And once you start doing that, I think you do start to get into trouble, right? It is tricky because I know the intention is good, right? Yes, we need more of these individuals and these groups to, let's say, be in science. But I think you start to get into very dangerous waters. And we've seen sort of, job descriptions for professors, right? Actual postings from, established universities where it says you must identify as a woman in order to apply. Well, and even the language there, identify as a woman. Well, then surely some, ambitious men are going to identify as women in order to be considered in that pool of candidates. Why would they not? Because legitimately you can. So
in
I
your
think
observation, Leigh, just to that point, where do you think the line is between leveling the playing field and maybe going overboard with this?
Yeah, I haven't established that line, certainly. I don't know. I mean, I try to, like, for example, in my treatment of students, I just completely look past all of this stuff. In fact, that's what's been sort of so appalling as in my experience over the last, since the pandemic, this awareness of the social justice movement and the ideology that sort of crept in, sort of taken over the university, it's made me think about these things when I wouldn't normally have done so. So, I would look at my students and I wouldn't see race and I wouldn't see, the colorblind kind of idea and I wouldn't see gender and I wouldn't care. And because all I care about is that they're enjoying the subject, which in my case is organic chemistry, which is not the easiest subject to enjoy, and I'm there to try to encourage them, and I just couldn't care less about any of this stuff, and then it's sort of been forced on me in a way because I've had to address it because it comes up, and it comes up continuously, and so now you start seeing race all the time, and now you start seeing gender all the time. Do you see my point? It's just like it's the elephant in the room. You're constantly being reminded of it. So that bothers me a great
devil's
deal.
Advocate, which I know is a bad word nowadays. I've just learned if we can't say devil's advocate, but I'm going to say it anyways.
I hadn't heard that one. Oh, really?
Yeah, I just recently learned that it's. I can't remember exactly. Yes, I wish I had the article in front of me, but I read a whole article as to why it's a bad thing to say now. It's racist, is what it comes down to, surprisingly. But
racist. Wow. Okay. Like against red people?
Well, okay. So you're going to be devil's advocate, and we're going to say that expression.
Yes. So I'll give you some background about me. So I, obviously I'm a female and a visible minority, but I'm also blind. And that's something that most people don't know. And in a school setting, I would have had to bring forth to my professors and, ensure that I was getting the assistance that I needed. So I think that in some ways, these things do need to be brought to the attention of professors. But I think what you're saying is that in many cases, it's needlessly brought to the attention of professors.
Well, it's funny you mentioned about that because I've just written a piece about accommodations. Again, there's another area which has become sort of a magnet for attention. Professors don't want to they're not particularly interested in, accessibility and things of this nature because it's not the subject. I mean, think about it, right? A professor like me is really interested in chemistry, right? And that's everything that, it's complete focus. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it and I wouldn't be any good at it. And then all of the rest is, stuff that we have to do. And I understand that, we have to do grading, which is very tedious, and we have to do administrative functions. And part of that is, of course, making sure that students, get accommodations when they need them. but it's just gone bananas, right? I mean, so I looked at this, and you mentioned blindness, right? In fact, the person that I replaced in my previous role as an administrator myself was actually legally blind, but you wouldn't have known it. And he concealed it pretty well. But that is a physically disabling issue for a student or for anyone in life, obviously. And so it's entirely sensible that accommodations are available for people like that. But if you look back at the numbers, right, I went back to 2015. In 2015, I started comparing classes of the same subject. So organic chemistry, similar size classes, anywhere between 50 and 100 students enrolled, and compared those over a 10-year period. And in 2015, the percentage of students claiming accommodations was 1.5%. So 1.5%. And this year, this summer, just gone, 2024, the percentage was 15%. So it's a factor of 10. It's a factor of 10. Now, some will say, well, look, back in 2015, people weren't comfortable declaring their disabilities and so forth. But in some senses, I think, disabilities that are demonstrable disabilities, like not being able to see, it's obvious that students of that in that category are going to make it clear that they need accommodation. And, so they're the ones that I 100% kind of believe. But I don't believe all the other 15%, or the 13.5% that have suddenly emerged in the last decade, right? So, and when you look more closely, a lot of it's to do with mental health, right? And so that is very difficult to assess. And I'm not saying people don't get anxiety, and I mean, I remember, it's right there. I remember, how scary it was to be going and doing exams, to study. You're desperately concerned that this is going to affect your career, which it will, and and trying to learn to deal with it, of course. And that people have different capacities to deal with anxiety and stress. But I don't think the answer is just to double their exam time, which is essentially what happens, right? Because I mean, it comes back to this idea of compassion. Right. So what I would get, and I'm sure you've heard this many times, is like my chair would say, well, you just need to be compassionate to these students, right? Just be kind. And that all sounds wonderful. I mean, of course, it's very hard to deny this, sort of like just be kind. And of course, people like Peterson and other commentators have thought about this and realized that if you're always kind to everybody all the time, number one, that might not be best for them, right? Because there are some hard truths out there and sort of, any parent will know this. You can't always concede to everything that the child wants. So there's that part of it. But also the compassion part of it is more to do with, well, who are you being compassionate towards? Because if you're being compassionate towards the people who claim that they need an accommodation or they need some concession, academic concession, then where's the compassion for the people who've put in all the work and are actually really talented and get the regular amount of time on the exam and have worked
if I can,
to those parameters?
And if I can interject here, because this is, of course, something that we work with our clients and patients all the time, is determining when an accommodation is needed for a mental health disorder. And I think the challenge that you're describing here is discerning the distinction between somebody who is anxious about exams versus has disordered anxiety and has a diagnosable condition, which requires accommodation. So I think that the lines of that perhaps have been blurred. And, people who maybe could learn some effective coping strategies as a student are being accommodated and then lumped into the same category as those who have a disorder that requires accommodations.
Correct. Right. I mean, first of all, is a physician involved in this decision? I mean, look, we don't know, right? So I'm just a professor, and so I just get a letter saying you will accommodate this person, and I kind of ask why. And all I can tell you is I know that 99% of the time, the accommodation is extra examination time. Now, that doesn't make sense to me, because if there are a proportion of people who are suffering from visual impairment, for example, such as yourself, then the accommodation may well be different, right? That you wouldn't necessarily need extra time on an exam, right? Maybe you do. I don't know. But
some
the
do.
accommodation, the accommodation might be that, the exam has to be in Braille or something, right? So why is it always extra time on an exam? That strikes me as a little bit odd, right? So people on my side are sort of questioning all of this and go, "Oh, here's another accommodation. Okay, fine." We don't really know how robust the decision making is, and I would argue it's not always based on medical professional advice. They have advisors who are, their job in the university is to make these determinations. And so, yeah, it's a bit sketchy as far as I'm concerned. And of course, why would I bother about this? Well, because I want to defend merit and I want to defend standards. And I will tell you beyond a shadow of doubt that I know this from talking with colleagues, people have just given up. So we just, okay, if you want an accommodation, you get it. It doesn't affect my subject. Interestingly, it doesn't affect my subject, because I could give you a chemistry exam and you could go away and I say, you've got a month to do this, right, and you'd still be stumped, right? If you hadn't studied for it.
The answers, right?
The answers are the answers.
Yeah.
Right. And, I have to be careful because of confidentiality, but I have a number of patients in various high-level roles in very important fields. I can say it broadly, whether it's academia, medicine, science, research, politics, and they all say the exact same thing. This is universal, at least among the people I speak with, once they know it's a safe space to talk about it. But we are seeing, after years of this kind of accommodation, and Malini, I've talked about this, again, accommodating the people who actually need it, give them a bit of a leg up, give that is fair and it's just, and it does make for a better society. But the over application of this sentiment is, ruining the mindset of the people who are in academia. They enter the work field or workforce with that mindset, and the people in those same positions, not aside from my patients, their colleagues, their superiors, they basically have the same, let's say, call it woke mind virus that has infected the universities. And so nobody is held to account, even in the professional realm, not just, the academic realm. If it was just school, you go, okay, fine. It's hard for the professors. They got to deal with these students, but, somehow, whatever. But the reality is those students do get into the real world and they spread that mindset and really the compassion. And you're right, Jordan Peterson has talked about it a lot. And people think he's saying not to be compassionate. No, compassion is obviously very important. But as Malini, I've said many times, good intentions executed poorly lead to terrible consequences or outcomes. And that's what we are seeing. And I see it from so many patients, and they're distressed because these are fields that they've worked so hard to ascend in. They loved their field, and they saw how good it could become. And I include psychology as well. Malini, I've talked about this. That's like with the feminization, and it's not about women per se. We want to be very clear here. It's not women per se. It's a mindset. It's a perspective and it's an agenda. And it's false compassion, because it's not very compassionate to the other people, nor is it compassionate to somebody to put them in a position that they're not really suited for, to elevate them to a place where they are going to do, they're going to do wrong by not only themselves, but the people around them. And this is what we are seeing. And I don't think it's hyperbole to say this. I've heard it from so many people in every industry that you can imagine. So
I think you summarize it very well. Just referring back to the piece that I was criticized on at the beginning in that video, it's one of the things they left out. I mean, I did make this anecdotal analogy to my own experience about how my best friend met his future wife at university. And that's just anecdote. And there are a lot of people who do. I mean, the point is simply this, and women, by the way, are particularly selective about this, which is that there's a tendency for people seeking partners to try to equilibrate to the same level. So if you go to university, you want a university trained, partner. Right. I mean, it's not that big a leap. The fact that he thinks I'm deranged in this in some fashion, it is not that big an inference, right? Once you know that people do, in fact, seek people of the same academic level or educational level of achievement. So if you've got twice as many women in university as men, and then twice as many women are getting degrees, which is fantastic for women, but right, and good on them, assuming the standards are still high, which we could argue about. Then the men are in the minority, and so women. And then if we're going to match them up, and if most women are going to be looking for a man of equal level of achievement and attainment, they're going to be out of luck, right? Because it's going to be very competitive. So I don't know how many women who get a master's in science are happy to marry a plumber. I mean, hopefully they are, but we know, from social science sort of studies that people do tend to want these things because it's on their checklist. I really feel I have to. You're thinking about the rest of your life, right? And you want to match up with someone who's perhaps been through the same experience as well. University is a very important time in your life, is it not? I mean, we think back to that era. If we're lucky enough to go to university, say, "Gosh, it changed my life," and so much happened in that time. So,
and whether
to
we want
say
to
that it
accept it or
doesn't
not,
matter,
there's something biological to it too. Whether we want to accept that or not, I think that Oren and I have talked about this before. That desire in heterosexual couples for a woman to have a partner that's going to provide and protect, and whatever that means within the realm of their relationship, is going to differ. But I think the term is hypergamy that plays into it as far as looking for a partner that is of equivalent or higher educational status.
Right. But status is the key word. I mean, because that's supposed to be the indication, right? Whether it was brute strength in the past or intelligence or a degree. Exactly. And adding to that, and I can't remember if you mentioned this in the article. I think you did, but I know I read several other articles, one of which by Barbara Kay, she's a writer for the National Post, where, and we've seen this, and so many people are talking about this, the divide in politics as well. Before, you could have a liberal and a conservative get married. These days, it's anathema to at least to the liberal side. Well, I know a lot of centrist and right-leaning people are like, hey, I'm totally fine with someone on the left as long as they're not woke, as long as they're reasonable. But we're not seeing it the other way around. So if we're seeing all these women who are getting their degrees and are liberal-minded, it's going to be harder and harder for them to find mates that they can, live with, especially when they're being told by their leaders, by the media, that those men on the right or center, who are anyone right to them, are evil, they're misogynistic, they're sexist, racist, colonialist, and everything like that. The messaging truly is leading to a divided country or countries, whether the States or Canada. And I'm assuming again, in the UK as well, and other countries in the West.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it's going to be the same. It bothers me really, because I don't like to see this battle of the sexes. I mean, I really, I don't want to be tarred with the brush of bigotry, which is what they'll always do. I mean, the other side will. I mean, I didn't even perceive it to be another side, to be honest, until relatively recently. But they will, I mean, I'm Gen X, right? And I'm actually quite proud of my generation in a way, because I feel like we've had a robust education and it wasn't diluted in any fashion. And we were political. Right, it's foolish to think that we weren't political at university, but the political movements were thing. I mean, I remember one of my friends, was really big on protesting Chinese occupation of Tibet and this sort of thing, right? So that was a big deal back then. But this more recent kind of identity politics, I think we avoided that. And so we have a view to it that is very much like, what's going on? I mean, I was aware of postmodernism, and we all knew that it was just a sort of intellectual foolishness, I would describe it, that you can get away with at university. But the idea it's being ported over into real life and now being applied is dangerous. I mean, it's clearly dangerous. I mean, science is applied to real life because science is objectively real, and it works. And this is why I find it really frustrating when you have those conversations with people who are coming from a position which is sort of this magical thinking about, like, for example, let's say gender ideology. So I have a gender identity, apparently. Well, prove it to me. It's unfalsifiable, right? So this is clearly problematic for me right away. And yet all of those folks are quite happy to flip a switch and have the lights come on in the house and the air conditioning in a condominium in Toronto, let's say, where I live, and, and drive a car with an internal combustion engine, or nowadays, an electric vehicle. And of course, constantly on their cell phones that rely on, quantum mechanics, essentially, and, stuff they don't understand, but really does work because it's scientifically grounded, right? I wish they'd just stop using all of those things, because if they believe in gender identity, then we're in this space, are we not, where it's kind of like shamanism. It's like a religion. And so we're in this religious zone now, and I just get very tired of it. I don't mind people having religions, mind you, but I do hate it when they foist it upon you, right? And I think that's kind of what we've seen. I think
that's the key of the challenge here, is the foisting upon others of different views and opinions and beliefs.
Right. Yeah, I mean, look, you can go and sorry, yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, sorry, Leigh, that when you talked about, like, I'm a Gen Xer as well, when we talked about not having politics, I would say we had politics, but if someone had it, if someone was protesting, if someone had a belief, we said, okay, that's their thing. It wasn't that if I'm not doing that thing, somehow I'm the bad guy. That's the difference, I think, that, that's why so many people are virtue signaling, because they want to be part of that group, because otherwise not to be is to be the other, and the other is bad. I think that's what the real shift would be.
It is now, yes. Yeah. So, demonizing the other side is the new sort of flavor of politics, isn't it? And we've just seen it. I mean, extraordinary. I never thought, of course, maybe I should have been a bit more intuitive about this, but I never thought that a TV show host and billionaire, in the construction industry would end up being, president of the United States. Although, well, Ronald Reagan was formerly a B-list actor, wasn't he? So, I mean, it is interesting who ends up in that office. And certainly I wasn't like, this is not going to work out very well, as was my thinking back, certainly in the previous Trump administration. And what we saw there was what was almost a clown show, I would argue, right? I mean, it was pretty funny to be seeing the constant sort of turnstile kind of changing of people getting fired. It was like watching The Apprentice, wasn't it? All these different characters that he had in his administration. And then for him to come back recently, and then, me in some sort of deranged way going, hooray. I mean, but I did. I did, because I couldn't imagine how the world is going to survive with Kamala Harris as president of the United States. Right. I mean, and that's because I'd seen all of this begin to happen in the last few years. So I've been politicized lately. And of course, that means I'm sort of a Trump supporter, which is funny because I'm no big fan of Trump. I don't think, as a person, but he clearly has the right policies, because he's focused on the economy, let's say, and he's also going to obliterate some of the gender ideology, which has gone way too far. And I think Canada will necessarily be drawn along that path as well. Canada's always considered to be more left-leaning, more socialist than the US always has been. But I think in all of North America, we're going to see the shift in the Western world, I think, now. So for me, it's a big positive lately. Although, of course, I'm not an American citizen, I don't get to vote, and it's their business, right? But all of this has deeply concerned me, right? And I don't understand the bit. I don't understand. You say it's the woke mind virus. We've heard that from Elon Musk and others, and the parasitic mind, from Gadsad.
From Gadsad, yes.
Yeah, we've heard that a great deal, but boy, is it spread fast. Right. And it's also really resilient, right? It seems that it can beat, critical thinking. And that's what really troubles me the most. Is I don't mind people disagreeing with me. I mean, it's always. I mean, like again, with the video there and that commentator. I mean, he's remarkably smug. It's like, oh, it's obvious that this guy's an idiot, essentially. He says this, and I don't mind. Fine. I don't mind him having that opinion, but I bet you when it comes to debating the topic, then they don't seem to have this capacity to really get down to brass tacks, as I would say. To really get into the debate.
Has that contributed to some of the challenges that you've experienced with your
Certainly.
colleagues in the workplace, where there's just no room for conversation?
Yeah, I mean that's the hard part of what's happened to me, I think. I mean, much of this began with a much earlier article in the National Post, which there's a poster actually that someone has made and put up in a coffee shop, actually on the St. George campus, which apparently is frequented by all manner of students. And it's a poster of that particular article. They've actually redacted my name, but the headline was, "I'm a U of T professor and I got into trouble for encouraging debate." So I did that because we had an event, right? We had an event at my department, chemistry department, for students. It was for undergraduate students, I believe. And they asked us all, because it was to socialize, and we weren't having very much of that. And of course, in the post-pandemic era, it's been really difficult to get back to kind of the environment that I knew university to be, which is a very social place. And so we professors were encouraged to come along and have activities for students to engage in this afternoon thing. And so students duly showed up. And one of the things I thought I'd do was some of Peter Boghossian's Spectrum Street Epistemology. So I had the IT guys come in with a big TV, and we put up some claims, and we had, kind of microphones and so on. And then the lines on the floor, and then we asked students to react to the claims, whether they agreed or were neutral or disagreed, and so on. And then I would go around, and because I'm the host, I would be neutral to the claim and then ask them why they believe those things. And I followed the rules of the game. And we started with some fairly simple ones, which really were unchallenging, if you like, but just to warm people up. And of course, eventually, because let's say, are vegetarians morally superior to omnivores or something like this, right? So people would argue this point. That's fairly benign, fairly anodyne thing. And then we'd move on. And I think what the pivotal point was where I put up a claim, which was, Jordan Peterson needs to be re-educated, something like that, right? Which, of course, has been a topic of much discussion. And then they started, okay, we have people agree and disagree, not surprisingly. And we proceeded until I think I got to men can become women, right? And it's just a statement. And of course, that started to get into the whole gender ideology area. Well, to be honest, the students really engaged in this. I mean, that was the funny thing. I started off with one or two people wanting to play, and at the end of it, I had like dozens of people wanting to play because they all wanted to get in there and start putting their opinions across, right? Well, a week later, I get called in to see the chair of the department and told that I'm a transphobe, and that
that's a long walk.
Well, no, if you put up a claim saying men can become women, that is transphobic because you shouldn't even be asking the question.
And how unfortunate. I mean, obviously getting an education is the main point of university, but isn't that type of conversation and debate and critical thinking the whole point of getting a higher education?
That is the whole point. That's the point I put across to my chair. And she said, well, and it was a female. And she said, well, yes, but you're not thinking about the students, in terms of how they're going to react. This is impactful to them. They weren't expecting this. We can have debates like that, but they need to have trigger warnings, essentially. So you'd done it kind of, so you've sort of done it in a surreptitious way. They didn't know what they were going to get, and you got progressively more challenging. And you should have stuck and to what was it? The ones you wanted? Pineapple belongs on pizza. Now that's okay. So you can have a debate about pineapple belongs on pizza, but you can't have a debate about. You can see why at that point I just thought, oh my God, this is a clown house. This is the University of Toronto. This is the University of Toronto, which is
the best in the country.
The best in the country. These are science students. Science, right? And yet we can't discuss these things without, kind of people, because imagine if I'd have put that up ahead of time and said, we're going to discuss whether men can become women. I would have had protests.
Where's the fun in that then?
There's no fun in that anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you wouldn't be able to actually have it because they would have protested.
And I would have been shut down. Right? It would have been cancelled. So that is the tenor of behavior and attitudes on the campus. And we're talking about senior professors, doing this. And now I'm being, I'm being beaten up by a chair who is an earth scientist because I'm a transphobe because I did that. So that's my point. And then the other piece to this is to say, if we've got twice as many women as men running the show, the alignment is, and you can argue this, Malini, because you can say this is wrong, but I think this temptation or the trait to be compassionate is stronger in women than men. Sure. I think men have a bit more of a sort of you can play this either way. Men's attitudes are a bit brusque and kind of like, well, shut up and get on with it sort of thing. And women are much more willing to listen. And there's some very good positive outcomes from that. But equally, if there's too much of it, and this is what I'm saying, it's like the suicidal empathy. That's the name of Gad Saad's next book, I understand, that he's writing. It's going to actually have negative effects. So that's what I felt. Does that chime with you? What do you think?
Yeah, and that ties into something I believe in our episode that we spoke about the feminization of psychology, is that, or maybe it was one about masculinity. In any event, I made the statement that we're veering in a direction where men are perceived to be failed women. And what I meant by that is, women have certain traits that, we are more skilled at, and men do as well. And that's not a bad thing, but men don't have to be women and women don't have to be men in terms of those personality traits and qualities and skills and so on and so forth. And even in a leadership position, myself being in a leadership position, I don't try to lead like a man. I lead in the ways that are natural to me and my qualities, and utilize my natural qualities. And that's what lends to good leadership. So to your point, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, and if I could jump in. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I'm sorry. Just because I don't remember, Ken, if it was your article or if I'm conflating with another article, but we were talking about, again, the ability to debate, the ability to have critical, to promulgate critical thinking, to engage in civil discourse. And again, I'm not sure if it was your paper or the other, or Barbara's, or article, sorry. But when the other side, if it's when the the worst part about feminization, or one of the worst parts, I should say, there's many, but one of them is that when you do get into a heated discussion, but it's civil, but when the other side feels that they're losing or they don't have an argument at all, they resort to, and I hate to say it, but it's tears. They start to get upset. They start calling names. They start going ad hominem, and that is that's men can do it. They do it sadly, but it's more of a feminized approach. And again, when I say feminized, it doesn't mean women per se. It's a name that we attribute to that type of demeanor and engagement style. And that's not engaging. It shuts down engagement. Call someone a Nazi, call them a fascist, call them all these different things. And again, look like you've been victimized by the words that this person uttered. You cannot have progress in that type of an atmosphere.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I was a child of the Thatcher era in the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher. And what's sort of fascinating about that is what a incredibly powerful, whether you loved or hated her, influential figure she was. And of course, there was this element of, she sort of suppressed certain feminine characteristics to a degree in order to get ahead. And some would argue, feminists would argue, this is terrible because she's sort of just becoming a male. But I think you could equally argue that in order to run a country, there are characteristics that you need to have. and they tend to align more with the male sort of spectrum of behaviors. And if women are going to do those, then they will need to, in order to fulfill the job sort of thing, which is you've got to be quite tough. And of course, she was a very tough leader. And that's a very good demonstration, I think, of how women clearly can do it. But I don't think it would have been a successful leadership if she had demonstrated all sorts of very feminine traits, right, of compassion and all this, right? So I think you have to look at what the job in hand is, and it's the reverse, isn't it? When you look at, I don't know, nursing, let's say, or any of the medical profession, but particularly nursing, where there's a lot of caregiving. And this is an issue that they've struggled with in Scandinavian countries, where they really want to get more men involved in nursing, but they just can't seem to be able to do it. Just men aren't very interested in giving care to anyone or something. I mean, we're not very good at that. Part of our brain is a bit switched off, perhaps, comparatively speaking.
And I think something I'll add there, just to your point about leadership, I think it depends on the job. It depends on who you're leading. It depends on the type of leadership, right? So in a position like that, leading a country, perhaps that is the case. Back to myself, I'm in healthcare leadership. That requires a different, type of approach, type of compassion, and so on and so forth. So I would hate for people to hear this and think that we're saying leaders per se have to be more male.
No,
it depends on the type of position. Yeah.
No. I didn't want to. But during that era, there was the Falklands War, and there were some pretty significant what I would call kind of masculine sort of decision making things to deal with. Healthcare is a very good example, I think, that you bring up, right? And I think, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I just before we shift from nursing, I have to say this, and I can say this with I think a very large sample size. The irony. Let's talk about nursing, where it is very female dominated, especially on the front lines. But the fact is, I have so many patients and students who are nurses, and everyone says that the environment in which they work is horrible. And it's not just the bad working hours and the conditions and everything that our governments have just destroyed in Canada and Ontario, but they say the interpersonal, the cliques, the targeting, the othering, the maligning of characters by certain people, the lack of any type of, let's say, justice when an injustice is perpetrated against any of the nurses. And it is, every single one says that it's all female dominated. And this is not me just hating on women. I'm not saying that. I've got 3 daughters. They know I don't hate on women. But the fact is, I'm just calling it out that there's something wrong with this approach. And because it's being masked by this label of compassion or this premise, it's a premise, but the reality is behind that is something very different. And every single nurse has talked about it. And they're going on leave because of the terrible conditions. Working conditions are hard enough. Interpersonal is what gets them.
Yeah, it's another thing that Peterson's talked about a great deal, isn't it? Because men can resort to violence to settle disputes, and women can't, and therefore there's a sort of tendency psychologically to have different strategies, I guess, to undermine. And so he's talked a great deal about that, where they're very big at destroying people's careers, it seems. So look, I mean, in recent days, what's happened to me, again, I've had another sort of incident, which will, I think, touch on what you've just said. So we've got an environment, let's say, which is a lot of female administrators. I'm not going to say, meaning the people who are kind of governing the university. There's a lot of those. And so I have had 2 chairs, both female. It's fine, except that I started to encounter some of these bizarre views, which I thought, oh, that's strange, particularly from the chemistry chair, right? And of course, I went on this crusade, I suppose, to write articles, really because I wanted to stretch my legs, or stretch my pen, as I actually wanted to start to see if I could write, and I haven't done so for a long time in this fashion, and Substack's a great venue for that. So I started writing and putting articles out as well in the newspaper, in the National Post. And what happened to me lately was I slipped up a little bit, I think, on one of my Substacks, and I probably named a couple of people I probably shouldn't. I don't know, really. I mean, one could argue this point. I mean, this is always about, when you're discussing something that's happened and you want to call it out, you do kind of want to point to the person who did it, especially if they were in a position of authority, and especially if they draw a salary which is partly paid for by the taxpayer. Right. So, I mean, I don't have that much sympathy. But anyway, I put out a piece which then was caught by someone who really objected and made a complaint. And so, I was dragged into the dean's office this time to be told, well, Leigh, you've basically compromised the university's policy on workplace harassment. So I by writing things on my Substack, I am now, thought to be, harassing colleagues in the workplace. And it was more than that. We have, for example, the dean had received threats of violence, apparently, from readers of my article of February 5th, where I mentioned him. And he claimed, I think, that I mischaracterized him. I'm not quite sure quite how, because I just stated he was the dean, and then I quoted some things that it says on his website, if I remember correctly. But maybe I did. Maybe I did, but, that triggered, apparently, threats of violence. I mean, I hope he called the cops. Right? I mean, I wonder if there's a phone call, right? Or are we perhaps, what does he mean? Does he mean he got some social media pile on? Well, okay, So and then there are other faculty members who've complained because I'm so intimidating, because I open my mouth. Right. I mean, that's why I'm intimidating, that they don't feel safe in a meeting with me. They don't feel safe in a meeting with me. And that means that the university needs to defend their rights to a safe space. And therefore I need to be castigated for this. So that's what we're dealing with. Now, I'm going to guarantee you that the people that actually made those complaints are female, because I don't think any man would actually do that. They're just, they tap you on the shoulder and say, I want to have a word with you.
Actually, sorry, but I will challenge you on that, okay? Because again, the feminization, it doesn't, again, there are many men who adopt those feminized approaches, right?
Well, they're the ones who are being successful. They're the men who are being successful, of course, in this environment. So I'm not one of those. So I'm not going to be successful in this environment. Right. No. You're correct. I think, and that's the other thing that I've noticed is I'm a gay man, right? But I have more testosterone and less limp-wristedness than colleagues who claim to be straight in my department because of their sort of feeble behavior. Right. I mean, they're just drones as far as I'm concerned, because they just kowtow to everything. And it's very boring. I mean, it's incredibly dull, right? Because you just know they're not going to say anything interesting. And then there's a cabal of women who all have kind of got this EDI bit between the teeth. And that's all they go on about. I mean, to the point where EDI becomes like, an agenda item for every meeting. I mean, seriously? That's all you can think of? We're running a university here, and this is what is a priority. So yes, it is. It's rather dull, and yes, men can get ahead by it's the cuttlefish behavior, which is to pretend to be something they're not really. But yeah, men like me just get really frustrated, right? I mean, I want robust argument. I'm not afraid of it. I'm not someone who resorts to physical violence ever, so I'm not that kind of guy. But I'm vociferous, right? So I'm strident. I'll go out there and I'll say, no, this is how I think and this is how I believe. And they just can't deal with it. So if they can't...
Sorry.
No, I'm just saying, if they can't deal with it, then we don't have a university as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Right. So if I can just say two things about that. One, in the Substack article where you named the person, okay, this is what we would call, if they are in a position of authority and presumably a position above yours, right, a dean, you're punching up, right? You are punching up. So, and we're talking punching up from a position of status within the university. They should laud that, because that's what that's what you're supposed to do. You're not punching down here. You're not picking on some student and naming a student. Right?
I would never do that to a student. Yeah. Exactly. Let me just clarify though. Yes, usually I punch up. There was one case, and I think this was one of the ones that was cited where I was in trouble, was that I criticized a manager who is not a peer. I mean, they're not faculty. So then you could argue that I was punching down because they're just managers. But I should point out these managers are completely unionized. There's nothing that I can do to disrupt that. And they were performing a task which I thought was ridiculous. And in so doing, I criticized them, but they had a managerial role. So I don't believe that counts as punching down either, but because we're different paths, right? But usually I criticize my boss,
Right, exactly. And I wouldn't consider that. I mean, I don't think someone has to always punch up. Again, punching down, very down is not the greatest. But in this case, if someone is in a position that's being paid for by the tax dollars, partially or in full, then yes, they should be held to account, whatever the position, by anybody, number one. Number two, you mentioned this a few times. You just mentioned it. I was going to say it before you said it, which is one of the most, I don't even know if I think it's blatant, but I think it was actually insidious. Manipulations that we've seen of language is saying that words are violence. Mm-hmm. That is one of the worst developments or regressions in the Western society, because then, because you said a few words, you are now violent. And because you're violent, we can, as you say, castigate, we can isolate, we can eventually terminate if they're going to keep at this. Because who wants a violent person on campus? And as you said, exactly, with the dean, I wasn't there. I'm not going to, I don't know what happened, but I have seen so many cases where people, and again, totally feminized, no masculine person, male or female, would do this, but we see these false claims where they say, I was attacked, I was this, that. No, you were criticized, you were held to account. Maybe out of 1,000 comments, maybe one or two were ugly. I get that. And that's all that they show. And they use that to totally negate the 998 credible, proper criticisms.
Yeah, I know. And so, I mean, in that particular instance, right, I mean, I've written about 20 odd articles, right? And one of them was flagged. And I probably slipped up a little bit. Which you're going to do. I mean, if I write 100 articles, there'll be some other thing I'll probably do. But I mean, it's not going to stop me from writing. It would just seem stupid. And so, I'm just sort of a little bit horrified by the attitudes that are prevailing now, because this is not the university that we want. Right.
No.
What we want, in fact, is a safe environment for everyone to speak their mind. That's what we actually want. Yeah. The words are violence conceptualization. I mean, that is utterly ridiculous. I mean, it doesn't make sense, as you know, because we all know what physical violence looks like. And then sort of using that word and sort of then using it to embrace insults. I mean, somebody could, we've already been insulted, right? So somebody says, this guy is foolish, he doesn't know what he's talking about, all the usual tropes. Fine, right? This can be, I'm offended by that. Well, fine, being offended doesn't mean you're right. And I think that's what they've kind of distilled it down to. So the first person who can press the button that says, I'm offended, is suddenly got a winning formula for whatever it is. It's like, well, then I've won I've won the debate because I'm offended. And it really doesn't. And if we're behaving like that in our institutions of learning at the highest level, what does that say about our society? So I'm hopeful that this will change. I don't think I'll be around for it. I mean, my view is I've done my bit for university, and I'm going to go off and do other things now, including continuing to write, but and maybe get more involved in what Peterson's doing, because I've joined up with his academy, and I'm really enjoying that right now. They have a challenge, though. I mean, this is the issue for university, right? There is a challenge. If you talk to people like Peter Boghossian, he'll say, burn it down. Right, the universities are over; they're done for. They've done it to themselves, but there's no point saving them. But there is an issue, of course, and that is the huge infrastructure investment that's been made in, let's say, science buildings, in laboratories. You cannot do science without the equipment. Much of it, millions and millions of dollars worth of equipment, and so you can't just switch to an online platform, can you? So I think we do have to save that, because all that money has been poured into those organizations, into those institutions. So I don't think we can burn it down. But certainly in the you could see shrinkage, right? I mean, we could certainly have the U of T close all of the departments that the grievance studies departments, right? We don't need those. We should limit ourselves to the subjects that actually have value to society. And I think those grievance subjects have demonstrated they have negative value to a society, right? So I don't think we should be continuing to pursue those. But yeah, there has to be change in my view, because otherwise the universities will they're just going to kill themselves, I think.
Well, we know they've lost credibility, and that's so sad because we want educated people. We want capable people, trained people, people who have critical thinking. And so if we all just denigrate universities as these places that need to be burned down, we're losing so much. It's the old throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? We need to save the baby, but get rid of some of that toxic water. And speaking of which, if I can just add this so people can understand this, it's just an interesting one of the sex differences. In a survey in 2017, they were asked, a bunch of college students were asked, if you had to choose one, diversity and inclusion, you could either protect diversity and inclusion or to protect free speech. It was almost 2-to-1 opposite. So female students said diversity and inclusion over free speech, almost 2-to-1, and males said free speech over diversity and inclusion. Obviously, we want all of these together to some degree, if done reasonably, but it just shows the mindsets. These are sex differences. And again, it's the problem is, the thing is that the people in EDI, right, they're not given a forced choice. That's a false dichotomy that you must choose one or the other. In the reality, we can have all of it, but they've made it so it is EDI to the exclusion of free speech or critical, and critical thought.
Malini, what do you think about that? Because that sounds like a shocking distinction, doesn't it? Like women prefer DEI.
It does. And as Oren was saying that, my vote was for free speech. And so I know you guys both mentioned being Gen X. I'm of the older millennials, so I went to university in the early 2000s, and I don't remember any of this crap, to be quite honest. Like, it was, I felt, a pretty balanced place to be, and a place for free discussion. I think that somewhere along the lines that all fell apart, but at least that time in the early 2000s, I feel there was a balance of the two, where there was room for discussion about EDI type topics without it becoming, an agenda, and doing so in a free speech way.
Yeah, something went horribly wrong, didn't it? Somewhere.
Yeah.
Because for people of my mindset, right, as I say, sort of grounded in, the philosophy of the Enlightenment and empiricism and all of that, but also very liberally minded, like classic liberalism. Of course we want women in science. Of course we want people of color. We want everybody. Right. I mean, it's so stupid. I get really fed up with all of this. Oh, well, science is a Western patriarchal, kind of oppressive regime. I mean, that in itself is the height of derangement. Science steps outside of all of that. I mean, science works equally well in China as it does here in North America. It doesn't care about race. It doesn't care about your gender. I mean, it works equally well. Women scientists are still working on the same principles. It's so narrow-minded to sort of attempt to reject science because it happens in human history to have emerged in some damp islands off the northwest coast of Europe and places like that, or the Industrial Revolution and so on. All of this sort of era happens to have. It could have happened anywhere. It could have happened anywhere. It didn't. It actually happened. Again, we can't rewrite history. Well, apparently we can rewrite history, as the 1619 Project tells us. Yeah, but it did actually happen in that place. But that's not important anymore. The important point is bring science to the world. I mean, the indigenous people of Canada will benefit from Western science. I know that sounds apocryphal. It's like, oh, gosh, why is he saying this? This is a colonial attitude. But it will. It's the truth. Right. If I was an indigenous person, I think, we need to interview those people a little bit more, listen to them a bit more. I think they quite actually want access to the modern advances of technology. Yes, I mean we should be sensitive to trampling all over them from a sort of cultural perspective, and I'm totally sympathetic to all of that. As a Brit who let's face it, in my history, we had 400 years of Danish oppression. Right, people forget this, right? But yes, the Vikings and Dangild, and we paid tribute to the Danish crown for 4 centuries. And then of course there was the Roman invasion. I mean, how long are we going to hold on to these things in the past, right? So all of this sort of fits together in my view now, and I've seen it happen. It's always the same actors who advance the narrative. I've been called out for being a colonialist and an apologist for the British Empire and all of this. And it's just boring. I mean, they have nothing to say of interest, any of these people. And they're not actually adding something positive here.
Back to your question and to Oren's point earlier, I'm just reflecting further on what you're saying. Social justice has always been something like at the top of my list, but not in the form that it's taken today. So I don't like saying that out loud because I don't want to be lumped into the category of, these far left individuals. But like social justice is incredibly important, but it's morphed into something that I don't even recognize.
So what would you characterize it as today? What would you want it to be, which it isn't?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think, very simply put, treating all people with kindness, compassion, recognizing that people are different and have different needs, but not placing one's needs over somebody else's.
Right. So, for example, the big hot topic about, let's say, trans women being admitted into women's spaces, who will be being compassionate towards, I guess, there?
And that's one that I struggle with because I know what the politically correct answer is. But to be quite honest, and Oren and I have spoken privately about this too, and I think probably on the podcast as well, I work out regularly at the gym, and that scares me, to be quite honest. Like I'm pretty fit for somebody who's 5'3", but the reality is, and this isn't to insinuate that any transgender person is going to be, a predator or somebody that's going to harm me, but the possibility is there, and that scares me and makes me uncomfortable. So I don't think that those rules and regulations are compassionate to people like me.
Right. So
not
that's
to
the
mention
point
the fact that I also can't see, right? There's that too, where I can't really keep myself safe and aware of my surroundings. So there's that too. So I think it's doubly discompassionate to me.
Well, because all these kinds of issues, they're complex, they're controversial, they're equivocal, they require nuance, and nuance is a word, we talked about vocabulary early on, that's a word I think is being lost these days. I don't know how many people, understand not only the meaning, but actually the need for it. And as you were describing about the histories and so on, instead of taking a nuanced take, most people just want to obliterate it and change, as we say, change history. And that's why, in a situation like this, the question would be, okay, do you, for example, trans people in change rooms, do you say if someone has fully transitioned surgically, then that's okay? Do you say if they're intact, like genitally, then they shouldn't be? Do they have to pass? And then people say, well, because it's so difficult, they take the unnuanced perspective of it, because it's so difficult. And if you said, well, only those who pass, well, then that's not fair to those who don't pass as a woman. So therefore, we should just not even think about it at all and just say, trans women are women, put them in, let them in. And we don't think about again, lack of compassion to people like Malini. And of course, more equally important, if not more so, young girls, who will feel uncomfortable and whose bodies are telling them, danger, danger. You are, you're naked. You're in a change room. You're alone. You're vulnerable. You see a male fully intact in that room who looks like a male, and your brain and body are telling you one thing, and you're being told by society, no, ignore what what your body is telling you, that survival instinct. You're supposed to ignore that. And again, those are the kind of things that's not very compassionate to rewire someone's whole experience. Especially when that reaction is to protect themselves. So, and again, by saying that doesn't, I don't want people to misconstrue that as being transphobic. I'm just saying these are things that we need to take into consideration that aren't often being taken into consideration for the name of inclusion.
Yeah. This idea of nuance that you raise, I mean, it's all about trade-offs, isn't it?
Exactly.
We need washrooms. in public washrooms, particularly in the workplace. So, do you go to the utter extreme and say, well, they're all just, anyone can go to any washroom and it's all sort of multi-gender or agendered or whatever it would be, and we don't care at all? And so you insist on, I guess, stalls everywhere, and so people can have privacy, and just go to that extreme. And that way it kind of, does that remove the problem? But of course, women's washrooms were introduced, certainly from my understanding in Britain, sort of as a result of the female workforce sort of coming into factories during World War II. And of course, the increased sort of harassment that those women then suffered in that environment, which was still, kind of had a lot of men present. And so they became mandated to create male and female bathrooms. And so, again, it's this trade-off. What do you actually want, right? Because there always will be those individuals, especially with self-ID, who are going to take advantage of the system and are going to come and threaten women, even if it isn't fair to label trans individuals in that fashion, right? I mean, clearly, trans people do exist. They have always existed. Only until relatively recently could they do anything significant to really change their gender. And of course, I would argue that you can't change sex. But, it's not got a long history in the sense of you couldn't do a great deal until relatively recently, because surgical intervention would have been a deadly cocktail. I mean, the idea of certainly cross-dressing and so on, as we've known this for centuries. But the idea that you would just allow anyone to access a women-only space because they can identify themselves to be a woman, that's obviously extremely risky. So the trade-off is, well, we want to be compassionate to all of these people, which is a relatively small number of people in society, and we're prepared, therefore, to be dispassionate about the fate of women who will, encounter harassment. And there will be, terrible to say, but there will be rapes that would not have occurred. Now, others will say, well, it doesn't matter just because you put a sign up on a washroom that says, women's bathroom. It's not going to stop men from going in, right? So I think, again, we could argue back and forth and say, well, a really persistent,
But I think a lot of this just ignores the rules of society, right? So you're right. Yeah. That doesn't stop somebody from a male from going into the female bathroom. But I do think that there's a lot of erasure and disappearance of societal rules and norms and understandings that are built into things, and hierarchy is gone. Like everything is just, whatever sounds best, theory. whatever sounds most politically correct is what goes.
Boundaries need to be dismantled, right? Sorry, yeah.
Exactly. But again, and you say, yes, you're right. I mean, on the one hand, a sign's not going to stop a predator from going in the bathroom. However, the easier you make it for someone with bad intentions to do it, we know for a fact human nature says that they will do it. And B, if a woman, and this has happened, I'm seeing stories on my X feed all the time, but not all the time, but a number of cases where a woman did oppose. She was feeling threatened. She was concerned. Someone was acting suspiciously, and they were fully intact. They looked like just a regular male, but he said, I identify as a female. He wasn't even trying to. And when they complained to the gym or wherever else they are, they're banned for life. They are told they are wrong. So, having a sign is not going to stop them necessarily. But if you saw someone in there, you could say, hey, get out. Now, if you say, hey, get out, you risk serious sanction and public humiliation.
Well, you're never going to please everybody, right? And I think, if you're just going to be statistical about all of this, we've got to look at how many people we're impacting. And women is 50% or slightly over 50% of the population. Right. And trans individuals are 0.2%. So, it's a simple decision, right? It's a simple decision, unfortunately, which is I totally want to be compassionate to people who are trans, right? But the reality is that compassion should not extend to, oppressing other people or putting other people at risk. particularly if it's a large portion of the population, i.e. women. So I think that's, and I've just found it astonishing how people are quite willing to go the reverse direction and the reason they will is because they think it's the voguish thing to do, that it increases their own status. It's usually a luxury belief, Rob Henderson. It's typically middle class, interestingly, typically middle class women, which I always thought was also very strange. It's almost like it's a suicidal kind of empathy, which is actually essentially bad for them, but they don't get to sort of have to deal with it, right? Like, having the double rapist kind of committed to a women's penitentiary, for example, or something like that. They're not going to see that. So I think the gender area it's a hot area, of course. I get very upset about it because, being gay means that I'm sort of, force teamed into this crowd of alphabet people, as they jokingly refer to it, LGBTQIAS2+. The LGB has nothing to do with the other letters at all, and so gay men like myself are beginning to recognize that this is really sucking us down into a bad place politically. I think I'm not comfortable with it at all. We're same-sex attracted people. Trans and queer and all of that is something completely different. Trans is to do with gender, of course. Queer is really to do with behavior, right? It's a social kind of construct, isn't it? It's a lot of straight people kind of identifying into the sort of LGBT collective. It doesn't mean you have to sleep. If you're a man, doesn't mean you have to sleep with a man. And so it's just a whole different, and we're supposed to stay together because we're all oppressed, right? But that, I don't think that's a very good argument.
And it's so interesting you say that, because that, I think, summarizes what I take issue with DEI initiatives, is that because of how I look and because of what I've experienced, I'm lumped into that category. But I still believe in meritocracy, and I still believe in all of the things that should exist, despite the fact that, I maybe meet some of that criteria. So it's really difficult to navigate because, like I said, social justice is really important. Accommodations are really important, but not in the way that it's being put out there, just like what you're saying about the LGBT population.
Well, I don't need anybody's sympathy because I'm gay, right? I mean, that's it. In fact, it's an insult, right? Oh, well, we need more LGBT folks running universities, let's say, for the sake of argument. What? Why? I don't need representation. I don't need to see people like myself on TV or in the media, right? I just need to know that I'm not going to be discriminated against because of my preference for men as opposed to women. I mean, that's all. Yeah. Leave the rest alone. Judge me on my performance or what else I do, because the rest is just this most appalling condescension. I mean, that's the bit that also really winds me up, right? It's so many middle-class people. I know you don't have class. Do you have middle-class people in North America, really? I mean, in Britain, of course, class is a huge thing.
Yeah.
But, people who are doing economically comfortably well, that then sort of demand that, because they can afford to. I mean, go and ask about gender ideology in, I don't know, some African state somewhere, where they're worried about famine or something.
Exactly.
They're just going to laugh at you.
Yeah, and by the way, just one thing, because you said this at the near the beginning, so I just want to clarify, because again, being anal about language, you said earlier like that I don't see color, and then people will take an unnuanced look and say, "Of course you see color, of course you see sex." Yes, we see it, but that's not the determining factor, right? That you base it. You base your impressions, you base your grades on merit, on behavior, on their character, not on the race or gender or sex or anything per se.
It goes back to the definition of color as well, because apparently white isn't a color.
Asian isn't anymore either.
Yeah, well, that's the point. I mean, it's just stupid. Let's stick to the physical definition of color, right? To do with the rainbow, and look, there's the rainbow, right? LGB and all of that. But seriously, let's stick to what we know color to mean. But then, people of color, that irritates the hell out of me as well, actually, really. Look, if you're black, you're black. If you're white, you're white. Okay, fine. And I don't mind, so they'll say he's a white man. Okay, fine. But I don't think about that. And I don't think people should think about race. Race is really an imaginary concept anyway. It's no biological basis for this, right? It's a continuum, right? Whereas sex is binary. I mean, that's the thing, right? Biologically speaking, sex is binary, race is not, right? Race is a continuum. And then we see the boundary of race, or we think we do. I mean, do you know? I mean, obviously, when you see people who've got mixed heritage, then it gets really complicated. Right, because they're blurring.
And I guess what I'll say is that I think that there's importance in recognizing that people from different ethnicities maybe have different experiences, and their experience isn't the same as ours. But that's where it should end. Right?
Well,
it's
culture.
more of a recognition and acknowledgement.
Yeah, that's culture as opposed to the way that race is used. I think it kind of it gets sucked into biology a little bit, or people kind of because it's physical characteristics that are involved, right? And those are kind of dictated by expression levels of melanin in your skin, right? Okay. So you produce a bit more pigment than me, or something along those lines, right? I mean, so there's
I can sit in the sun longer than you, therefore.
Well, right. I mean, and so I find it a little bit tedious. I mean, ethnic distinctions clearly are important because it's culturally embedded, isn't it? It's like you're being brought up in a particular environment. And then you take on there's that word tropes, but you adopt all of the cultural memes of that particular. I mean, I'm English, right? So I drink tea, and I do, right? Gosh, what a stereotype. No, I don't have a pocket watch, and no, I don't own a mansion or something, but no, I do have an English accent apparently, and so on. So. Yeah, I mean, I thought that's all fun, actually. I mean, don't you just love the cultural diversity? I mean, that's the best bit. And even in social context, it's always awkward these days to ask people, where are you from? Because they, could be that they're going to attribute to, what do you mean? I'm from Toronto. There's to sort of get around it because you're in the same city as me. Well, you know what I meant. But that's kind of inappropriate. I mean, I don't have a problem saying I'm from Britain, that damp island full of miserable folks that drink tea all the time. It's interesting, right, to ask people about their background, to learn about who they are and what they stand for and what their cultural experiences are, which are doubtless different to mine.
And that's a tricky question. And admittedly, I have a hard time with that one because I think it's the way in which it's asked.
Right.
Because I will say people have asked me in a very racist way, and like they do the speaking louder to me because I look like I don't speak English and things like that. So that obviously makes me mad, and I will be a shithead and respond with, "I'm from Windsor. I was born in Windsor."
Good for you.
But
there are times where people like me genuinely ask because, for good reason, right? So
that's the thing. If it's a conversation or someone wants to know about, my heritage and my ethnicity, I'm happy to talk about that. But it's, I guess, the way in which it's asked that matters.
Right. So that's the sort of sensitivity of discourse that, I think. Okay, so we get into political correctness to a degree, don't we? I think at that point. I just don't. I mean, look. I think you can slap people on the wrist if they behave that way because it's, that's, quite rightly. On the other hand, I don't think you should get sort of like screaming kind of into, sort of hysteria, which we see. I mean, I'm not saying you would never do that, I'm just sure, but neither would I. But we see it on X, don't we? And we see the screaming hysteria. I've just been misgendered. I mean, the idea of misgendering
because I think people are going into these conversations with the assumption that somebody is being violent and harmful and, fill in the blank with whatever word they're assuming there.
Yeah, benefit of the doubt is another term that seems to be lost these days, right? You don't give the person the benefit of the doubt. They must have evil intention when they ask that question or say
forgiveness. Where's the forgiveness?
As well. Forgiveness as well. Right.
Good Christian values. I mean, I'm not religious. I'm an atheist, but not surprisingly, being a scientist, it's quite common for scientists to kind of not really kind of be very keen on God and, sort of Richard Dawkins and so on. who was a tutor of mine actually, and at university.
Really?
But
Okay.
yeah,
The
yeah, yeah,
self-esteem was a game changer for me.
yeah.
When
He
I
was
read
at
it.
Oxford when I was there,
Wow. Cool.
in the Department of Zoology. And so yeah, I'm not religious because I tend to believe in an objective reality in the world, and it's hard to reconcile that with this unidentified being, right, like a god. But I do recognize that religion in society is an enormous value proposition, right? And so the faith that, it comes with all these rather pleasant sort of behavioral characteristics, like, forgiveness and charity, and I why we need more of that.
Yeah.
I totally expect never to be forgiven by my colleagues. You see, I was talking to Peter Boghossian, and he was saying, Leigh, they absolutely despise you for what you've said, and and that's just the reality, unfortunately, because they won't see it as anything else, and it's really sad, isn't it? It's
very
really
sad.
So yeah, I mean, personally, I find it difficult to go onto campus these days, not least because of the question of LGBT and all of that. That's another issue that I encountered. That my department, the second department I'm in, they decided to have an event for all faculty, which was an award-giving event, to recognize the contributions of faculty members. I never get those awards, of course, but it was open to all. And then I noted that, they were having the photo ops for the award winners in front of a balloon arc, an arc of balloons that was in all the Pride colors, right? Because it was happening during June, it was happening during the Pride month, and I just felt really uncomfortable about that because it was taken as a given that the Pride colors, and I mean the progress colors. So I don't have a problem with the regular rainbow flag, which had a reason for its existence. It meant everybody, it was to bring together everybody. The colors didn't have an actual meaning in the sense of to do with race or something. And then they added these other colors that you'll know about, all the chevrons and all of that. And of course, that drags you into this belief system because it embraces the trans ideology. It also brings race into it because it has a black and a brown chevron on there as well, which doesn't really have a place because race has got nothing to do with sexuality. And so, but they use all sorts of specious arguments like, but some of the leading figures of the Stonewall riots were black, or, or were trans, or, so what? That doesn't matter. They were fighting for same-sex rights. That's what the point was. I mean, so what?
And they also happen to be.
They also happen to be. Yeah,
else.
exactly. Yeah. It's intersectionalism coming into play. So as soon as I saw that, I objected, right? And I had a meeting with the higher ups to kind of explain why I felt uncomfortable, because that flag essentially correlates with gender ideology, and therefore it shames same-sex people, for example, for not including members of the opposite sex in their dating pool. In other words, I'm supposed to accept a trans man in my dating pool if I go on Grindr or some sort of app. Yeah, the gay men have an app called Grindr that I know people know about, and it's a kind of a hookup app, I guess. Gay men are always seeking sex. It's a very common trope amongst gay men. I don't think I'm shocking anyone with this. But the reality is that app won't actually allow you to exclude trans men. Right, because that would be bigoted.
So you're not allowed to have a preference, is what that means.
No, you're not really. So, but of course, the reaction to this, of course, you'll guess it's quite extreme. But men will very quickly ask you for a picture of your genitalia, right? Because they'll demand a picture of your genitalia because you can't fake that. Right, is the idea. They want to know that you have the appropriate tackle, so to speak. So, I mean, it's typical of men, isn't it, that they would do that because they're focused on on getting to the bedroom quickly. So, but the point is simply, you could end up chatting on an app like that and hook up with someone, not knowing, in fact, that they're essentially a biological woman. And if you object to that, that's transphobic. Well, this is a kind of homophobia.
Right. And we hear much more of that. Just so you know, speaking of chatting, we've been chatting for a long time, so we're going to have to wrap it up. But
sure.
I just want to say that we hear much more of what you just described in the converse, where it's, where it's women are saying, I have men who I can't, lesbians saying I have men whom I can't exclude. Right. And in that case, I see that much more, and they call it the cotton ceiling, right? Where right. So trans women are saying, why can't I, be allowed? Even if I haven't changed anything at all, I identify as a woman. How dare you not let me,
but what are they going on there? They're going on there to meet people, aren't they?
Right.
Right. So, with presumably the intention of a sexual encounter eventually at some point. I mean, lesbians are probably not as aggressive.
Having something that they're looking for in particular or not looking for, just like anybody else would. But I'm hesitating to say these words out loud because I can see how they'd be perceived.
Yeah. Right. No, I just noticed it in the gate. Anyway, so I raised that with these folks and said, well, why are you doing this? And they basically dismissed me, right, completely, and just said,
Leigh, what keeps you going with all of this? Why don't you just sit there and be quiet and do your job and go on with life? What keeps you going?
There's these things called principles that much of society seems to have abandoned or forgotten. Which is that it's so easy to I think, forget your principles and just parrot what's the prevailing wisdom, just so that you're not bothered. But I've got to a point in my life where I just don't care what they do to me. I guess I have a certain sort of privilege in that regard, and so this is a battle which I think is worth fighting for. And I think we're seeing the turning of the tide, to be honest. I think obviously Donald Trump's going to bring some change to North America. I think Canada, if it votes the way that we think it probably will based on polling, will have a majority Conservative government this time next year. And again, although I don't think Poilievre is going to be quite as aggressive as Trump, but I think he will stamp out some of the EDI. And so I think there's a sea change happening, and I think common sense is coming around. But there are academics like me who also believe in that. We're not all crazy, but I would say 9 out of 10 academics are deranged in this particular area. It doesn't mean they don't know their subjects, but they've lost the plot. And I'm not prepared to lose the plot. So it keeps me going. I enjoy the conversations. Today's been great. Thanks for the opportunity. I hope I wasn't too outrageous.
We like outrageous.
and I love the opportunity to debate.
Oh, we like provocative and thought-provoking. And I think that's what this is.
So, absolutely. Okay. Yes. Thank you so much, Leigh.
Yeah.
All right. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it was great speaking with you. And I encourage you. And, it sounds like you've been contacting or communicating with, some heavy hitters in the field of, critical thinking and trying to bring, civil discourse to society, like Peter Boghossian, Jordan Peterson. People may find them uncivil, but that's in the eyes of the beholder. So again, yeah. Okay, so
I think the point is you have to be a little bit prepared to upset people in order to table the ideas.
Yeah, exactly. That's the nature of difficult conversation.
Yeah. Exactly. So
we had one today, which is good.
Let's hope so. I think the three of us did not find it too difficult, but I think some people will find the topics and the perspectives challenging. And if we can challenge people, that's good, right? It is good to challenge, and just again open people's minds and hope that we can move in the proper direction. So.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to see, just in closing, I would just say what I would like to see is a discussion between two people who've got very clear different views, one more on my side and one coming from the other side, where the person on the other side does not lose it and resort to ad hominem type attacks like we've seen in the media on X and on CNN and so on, where, I think, was it one one panelist was just completely losing it because another said about boys, being, you saw
Right,
this one about, in girls' sports, I think it was, and just completely lost it. What we need is someone from the other side to engage properly in a thoughtful way without, kind of losing their rag. I think that's what I'd like to see.
Right, exactly. Well, on that hopeful note, until next time, everyone, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel.